Is it about that? Or should we wait a bit? Sorry? Should we wait a bit or is this about that? Okay. Sure. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. So, what I'm going to talk to you today as part of this invited lecture is about the importance of failing. And this lecture by itself is kind of an example of that because I have no idea how this lecture is going to go. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here that I've wanted to talk about for a long time. Whether or not I do justice to any of it, we're going to find out. But part of the theme of this lecture, if it has a theme, is that one of the important things about being genuinely creative is being willing to fail occasionally. So if in a room full of people I don't necessarily know very well, or even worse, people I actually do know very well, if I'm willing to sort of take this chance of failing at something, I'm hoping that's a lesson that you sort of take away from this. First thing to point out is that this lecture is also probably going to be a little bit weird, at least for a while. We're going to start off talking about stuff that probably you'll think to yourself, this doesn't connect with anything we've been learning about so far in this course, perhaps even in this program. What I'm looking to talk about here, and this I'm going to give thanks to Morteza for giving what is essentially the theme of this lecture, which is it's not so much about methodology, but rather it's a way to think about what we do with methodology. And part of this is also me trying to convince you of something that you may not necessarily be instantly convinced about. And that thing is, we are in, as far as I'm concerned, the midst of a creativity crisis. The creativity that has normally been part of everyday life, part and parcel of life, has gone away. And it's gone away probably over the past 20 or so years. Some of you are too young to have noticed this. Because everything's new to you, you're very young. Some of us who've been around for a bit longer have seen the fraying of what we might consider to be creative practice. So I'm, again, as part of the risk of failure here, I may be trying to convince you of something that you are fundamentally unconvincible of. Unconvincible? Impossible to convince of. But also I want to talk about some things that are a little bit outside the normal orbit of what we might think of interaction design. I want to talk about the principle of hauntology, which is going to be something that's very significant as part of this lecture. I'm going to talk about psychogeography as something that is perhaps an example of a weird and unusual tool that you might find useful for your assignments. And we're also going to talk about the slow cancellation of the future, which is to say, it is now realistically almost impossible for people to imagine a future that isn't based on the tropes and the stereotypes of the past. So as I say, there's a lot in this lecture, and a lot of it is going to require you to give me a little bit of leeway here. It's going to be a while before it connects to anything that you may have spoken about elsewhere in your courses. This idea of a crisis in creativity is something that is very much linked into also this idea of failure, because failure is one of the things that generates real opportunities for creativity. If you know something is going to succeed, it's not a particularly creative approach to use that thing in your professional practice. So we're going to talk about how to sort of break out of that mindset, or at least I think we're going to try and talk about it. So before we get to any of that, before we get to what I'm offering you in terms of actual useful information, we're going to talk a little bit about setting the scene of this idea of the creativity crisis. Once upon a time, and it wasn't even necessarily all that long ago in the great scheme of things, culture was something that you experienced as an activity, a thing that you went out of your way to experience. If you wanted to see Shakespeare played at the Globe Theatre, you had to go to the Globe Theatre. If you wanted to hear Mozart play, you had to go wherever Mozart was playing. Once upon a time, most of the things that we dealt with in terms of what's regular culture nowadays were effortful. You had to spend some time actually putting yourself in the right kind of place. Literature is an example of this. In the days of, for example, Dickens and such, almost all of the literature people encountered was essentially in audiobook format. By which I mean that you would go to readings, you would go to listen to Dickens read, or you would have an evening where the family gathered around a book and would read out passages to each other. The idea of reading as a thing where you sat down and did as a sole passive activity, kind of relatively recent in the past 100 years or so. Once upon a time, movies we used to call plays. You would go there and you would have somebody act things out. But again, it was only something you could do at the time in that place. What I'm saying by this is that originally, and for most of human history, culture has been something that's transient. It's something that we experience briefly within a context, and then it's gone. Once you've listened to Mozart play live, you can't re-listen to it. It's gone. That moment is gone. And as a result, culture for most of human history has been a lot livelier than it is now, because it was something experienced in social environments. It was something that would come with a lively atmosphere. It wasn't something that was consumed alone. It wasn't something that was consumed as, something that was part of your individual interest. There was almost always a social collaborative part to enjoying culture. At a certain point, that transience started to disappear, and we started to record cultural experiences. We, for example, used to call oral storytelling as a tradition used to be an incredibly important part of communities staying together. But over time, oral storytelling became books. Books, still part of an oral tradition, as in you would still read them out loud to people. But gradually, we went from having the necessity to be in somebody's company to being able to just pull a book off the shelf and read that. Musical performances then began to get recorded in, wax cylinders, and then shellac records, and then vinyl records, CDs, and all these different kinds of things. Over time, that's kind of become something different. It's become essentially Spotify streaming. And every time a medium changes, every time we move from one medium to another, something of the nature of the experience disappears. Talk about that again in a bit. Plays, somehow, all became Marvel movies. Those are the only movies that exist these days. They're only movies that get released. So somehow, all human playwriting is just Iron Man. But maybe in some fringes of popular culture, you might have find other kind of movies elsewhere. But plays, this idea that you would sit and you would watch an adventure or a story unfold in front of you, gradually became movies and TV shows. With that, what changed was this transience that was part of human culture. This idea that you experience something and then it disappears. We now have a different kind of way in which we experience culture. We experience culture as a thing that's accessible at almost any time and with almost no real effort on anybody's part. As I say, if you went to listen to Mozart and then you left that auditorium, that experience was gone. All you had were memories of it. There is a point whereby we shift from transient cultural experiences to recorded cultural experiences. And almost everything that comes before that point is permanently lost. It is not possible nowadays, for example, to listen to Beethoven play live because nobody recorded it at the time. One of the things that culture historically has done is get out of the way. Once we're not done with it, but once new ideas come along, old culture tends to disappear. Now, I see here, as I'm writing this, listening to Taylor Swift perform Cruel Summer live. Now, I was not there to listen to Taylor Swift play live. Probably a good idea, because I'm fairly sure I would have ended up on some kind of list, because it seems to be a lot of young girls that go to Taylor Swift concerts maybe wouldn't fit in there. But I can open up the album and I can listen to this and get this experience of what it's like to listen to a particular artist play live in a particular venue. There is a certain window in which this is true within the cultural record. And then anything before that, we've just lost these experiences permanently. I think this is a problem. And I think it's a problem because loss is important. Loss is one of the things that makes way for other ideas. We have kind of lost the ability to forget about culture. We have largely offloaded our cultural memory onto technology. And many of us, we've offloaded our personal memories onto technology. How many of you have, I'm going to show my age here. How many of you have a Facebook account and have some photos on it? And you see the show memories from the day button and you press it? How often do you look at that and think, I have no recollection of this thing that happened? Where did this picture come from? I've never even seen these people before. Because it's so easy for technology to record our experiences, we lose the value of those experiences by giving them over to technology, and technology is fallible. You know, we think about these things as sort of permanent records of our lives, but all it takes is Facebook deciding that you're a wrong one, and then that's your account gone. And so is, in a lot of cases, your entire life history as far as photographs and things go. So what we have now is this massive archive of culture. You can listen to any artist within reason that you want to. Do you want to listen to the Beatles? Go listen to the Beatles. You don't actually have to be there for it. You want to hear the Beatles at Madison Street Gardens, or you want to hear Bruce Springsteen at Madison Street Gardens? Again, showing my age here. You want to hear, well, what would you be interested in? Kanye? Is that modern? I don't know. Whatever you're interested in, you can see these live performances, and you can, or hear these live performances, or see and hear these live performances. So this vibrancy of temporary culture, that you had to be in a room for something, was an important thing that has been lost by the fact that we can now access what we want wherever we want. That's what I'm referring to, this idea of the loss of loss. The accumulation of culture over the past 40 or so years has been extraordinary. Extraordinary to the point that it's almost, in fact, it's not almost, it's absolutely outside our ability to process it. There is no subculture of interests. There's no hobby, no subculture of a hobby that any one person can realistically keep up with all of the content that's produced. That, as I say, is a problem. When Mozart died, there was a massive flowering of creativity. Mozart dominated music for a long time. Everybody knew at the time that Mozart was something genuinely special. And so a lot of people were it was kind of competing to see who was going to be next to Mozart in terms of significance. Nobody was competing to dethrone Mozart. Everybody was competing to be this person who was second best to Mozart. When Mozart died, the pressure came off a lot of people. And a lot of people then felt at that point there, they could flower in a way that they weren't able to before. People in Mozart's shadow found it very, very difficult to do anything when it's a case of, all I'm ever going to be is an afterthought. All I'm ever going to be is an also-ran here. When people experience these things in context, in social environments, in the times in which they were actually first performed, there's a kind of progression that happens. You experience the thing, and everybody experiences it differently depending on your particular, the mindset you have going into things. Everybody has their own particular unique experience of an event. But that experience gradually wears away. Our memories become a little bit hazy. It's one of the reasons why we tend to record all these things in Facebook and Instagram and all these different kinds of places. Our memories are unreliable. So much so that they've done experiments, and what they've basically shown is that if you ask somebody to remember their teacher when they were like 10 years old or whatever, and they say, okay, yeah, so describe your teacher. Then you say, didn't your teacher have gray hair? And then people go, oh, yeah, they will. And the memory will actually change to match this new reality. Our memories are only partially reliable. They're only partially based on the events, but they're the best that we have in a lot of these kind of circumstances. But eventually, even those hazy memories, those fade. And what we get from that is kind of a core, a nub of the experience, something for us to actually build other things on top of. Memory becomes fragments of experience, fragments of recollection. Like my earliest memory from childhood is me standing beside a car on my first day of school. But when I actually think back on it, I don't have that memory at all. I have the memory of a photograph that I was shown, which was me standing by a car on my first day of school. So we take these little fragments that survive and we sort of build these as part of our understanding of the world. Those fragments then, culturally, across the wide range of people, will gradually disappear, they'll distort, they'll change their form, and those become the seeds of other kinds of creativity. Death here, let's say here, death is the birth of new opportunities, and that's basically how culture works. In order for us to genuinely create new things, old things have to go out of the way. The very first recordings that were sort of commercially available or available to a lesser extent in people's homes were, for music, were shellac recordings. Shellac is a material that's quite fragile. So you would buy these things and they would often distort or crack or all these different kinds of things. And also at a certain point, quite expensive to get hold of. Shellac is also a material that's used in explosives and artillery shells and all these kind of things. This here, though, was the start of a new way for people to really experience music, completely devoid of its original context, completely devoid of its original performance. But the thing that sort of saved culture at this point here was A, the equipment, very expensive. This was sort of luxury equipment that you might have if you had lots and lots of money. The recordings were still relatively hard to get hold of. And there was a big local aspect to culture, which meant that just because there was a record available in one place doesn't mean it's available where you'd want to be. When we have these kind of recorded experiences, what we're basically then doing is attaching a permanence to culture, and that becomes a problem. I keep saying this becomes a problem. I will explain what the problem is. I'm not just expecting you to pick this up by yourself. There is a YouTube channel I love, which is called You Can't Unhear This. And what it does is incredibly deep dives into the Beatles' back catalogue. And when I say deep dives, what I mean is looking to see what cuts in the studio were mixed to which other cuts and which person is playing this instrument, these particular places there. When we move from format to format, when we actually start to gather these permanent recordings, what we lose is the messiness of human experience. You know, the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, and it's available on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, obviously. But what we get there is the performance on that album, which is not a live performance. It's not even a studio performance. It's a Frankenstein of all these different kinds of performances. It does have a certain degree of human messiness to it, and again, we'll talk about that in a second, but it's not the actual thing itself. It's something that stands for the actual performance. Most of this media, in fact, all of this media until relatively recently, has been physical. And physical media comes with a number of cultural safeguards built into it. Most of them you'll already be very familiar with. How many of you have had, for example, bookcases full of books and then had to move someplace? Horrible, isn't it? It's a massive pain in the arse. And then you think to yourself, well, maybe I'm going to get rid of some of these books so that I don't have to move them in the future. And then you end up buying a whole bunch of other books. The fact that physical media has that permanence, that actual physical aspect to it, is a moderating factor. You need places to store things. You need money to buy things. You need to be in the same place as the collection to be able to do anything with it. When these different forms of recording media came along, there was a great enabling of access to experiences that people wouldn't otherwise have. So if you were not at Woodstock to hear Jimi Hendrix play the Star Spangled Banner, it's not actually that much of a problem. There's recordings of it available. You can experience that event. But it's not the same thing as experiencing somebody playing the same thing on another day or in a different concert. So this permanence is a limiting factor, that we have this limit as to how much we can access, how much we can have, what we can actually get hold of, and where we can store these things. And what that means is, if you are a hardcore collector of vinyl records, there is a functional limit to how many vinyl records you can have. It's probably not even that much. Just out of curiosity, how many of you actually collect vinyl records? Yeah, nobody willing to admit to being a hipster. Yeah. Vinyl records, because of the size, because of the relatively limited capacity that's built into them, you can only dedicate a certain amount of any living space to these things. Now, we often say, this is how much I'm giving over to the books, this is how much I'm giving over to the records or whatever, and it spills out from that point onwards. But we're all forever aware that these things take up space, and space is finite. There is this limited consequence that spatial reality is something we can't actually deal with. We can't just say, well, let's put more space in. You know, back in the 60s and the 70s, one of the reasons why American farmers are in such a bad state these days is the advice was buy land. It's the one thing they're not making anything any more of. And it turned out, yeah, that's great as long as the land is actually providing, income. But they're not making any more space. So when we actually have to dedicate certain amounts to physical storage, that is a limitation. But that limitation gradually wears away. So we have big shellac records, and then we have smaller vinyl records. Then we have cassette tapes, and then we have CDs, and then we have MP3s, and then we have streaming music. There gets to a point where that limiting factor of spatial reality stops limiting anything. Average CD, maybe a quarter of the size of a vinyl, which means you can store 4 times as many of them in the same kind of space. Quality is higher, so people think, yeah. So people think, oh, so this is actually like a better medium as well. It's not just smaller, it's better. When cassette tapes came around, they were tiny in comparison to a CD. They're like half the size of a CD. Sort of contemporaries in terms of these technologies coming around, but it took a while for CDs to become commercially successful. For a long time, though, even permanent culture was relatively inaccessible. Now, I suspect there's going to be only a few hands going up here, but how many of you have actually listened to music on a cassette tape? Ah, that's good. So one thing you'll probably notice when you listen to music on a cassette tape is it gets worse the more you actually listen to it. You'll listen to a tape, goes through the system, there's a whole mechanical thing in place, and the tape degrades a little bit. Then you play it again, and the tape degrades a little bit more. You play it again, and the tape degrades even more. When I was young, there was a vibrant subculture in taking musical tapes that you had, recording them, and giving them to your friends. And then they would do that for their friends, and they would do that for their friends. After a certain amount of these reproductions, what you end up with, when you put on the Beatles, that's the level of quality you get from it. Because every time you record a recording of a recording and these kind of things, the quality gets lessened. So the more you listen, the less the thing is like it was before. The more you listen to a vinyl album, the more scratchy it becomes, the more it hisses, the more it pops, and the more occasionally it'll jump between the grooves. Then there becomes another shift. So we move from this idea of transient culture to essentially permanent culture, and this idea of permanent physical culture to permanent digital culture. And that's, I think, at the point at which we really see things changing. When we go from cassette tapes, which wear out with use, to CDs that don't wear out with use, we're still limited in terms of there's a physical collection of CDs that we have. When we do, like, for example, road trips in a car, and you have like a CD player, the CDs that you bring with you are your entirety of a choice as far as music goes, other than radio. But when we move from CDs to digital representation, again, that goes away. The spatial consequence is gone. And suddenly, what we get is an abundance of culture that we have no way of actually meaningfully processing. For most of recorded history, so when people are actually getting these physical devices, there is still a regionality that changes the availability of what you're able to get. I grew up in Dundee, which is a small city in Scotland, and if you wanted to buy, no judgments for those who know this band, if you wanted to buy an Indigo Girls CD when I was young, no chance at all that you could buy an Indigo Girls CD. You could buy Della Mitri, because they were a Scottish band. You could buy the Rolling Stones, because Rolling Stones were available everywhere. But if you wanted to buy, and again, don't judge me, a Sarah McLachlan CD or something like that, a Tori Amos CD, it was much harder to do. Because certainly at the time, Scotland, not really a culture massively interested in the sort of softer, sad girls being sad kind of vibe of the music. So where you actually lived had a big difference in terms of what you could buy. You lived in London, you could probably buy anything you wanted if you went to the right shops. You lived where I lived, you bought what was available, and that was pretty much it. But on top of that, a lot of releases were regional. Like back in the 80s and 90s, there were a whole bunch of computer games that were just purely about the region where you lived. Nobody was making any money from them, but people made them because they had fun making them. And these things were unavailable anywhere else. Lots of small subcultures of music were similar to this, in that you would have particularly vibrant scenes in particularly localized contexts. And that'd be the only place you can actually experience these things. People often talk about the mods versus the rockers as one of like the big cultural clashes for the UK in late 70s, early 80s, that kind of thing. But really, that was something that was only confined to places like Birmingham and Liverpool. You had to go to these places to engage in these scenes. They weren't in your backyard. The big thing, though, is it wasn't possible until relatively recently to own a physical or own a digital version of all the physical media you would want, because you had this physicality to it. There was a limit. You had to choose. You had to choose curation. You had to think about, what is it I'm actually collecting here? Am I collecting all the synth rock of the 80s? In which case, have a word with yourself, Pauline. Or are you listening to, hard rock from the 60s? Are you collecting all the Beatles albums? Or are you collecting all the Rolling Stones albums? Because certainly back in the 60s, it was one or the other. You had to pick what your collection was. And what that basically meant was there was a requirement for curation, which is to say, if you can't save everything, if you can't have a copy of everything, then what is it you're actually choosing to value? Curation as an activity is one that's incredibly important, because it's what lets us see as people what has value and what doesn't. So this form of curation, for a while, was something handled by cultural commentators. So you would have, for example, radio DJs, and they would pick what the hit songs were going to be. Hit songs were basically the ones that the radio DJs chose to play again and again and again. You might outsource this to newspapers or magazines. The NME in the UK or Melody Maker in America were where you would find hip, cool releases reviewed. That's how old this is. Hip and cool were words you would actually use unironically. And these would tell you what are the things that you should be interested in because they're new and they're interesting. These were tastemakers. But also it created a role for your weirder friends who were into the stuff that you'd never heard of, for them to bring this in and say, listen to this album here. And for those of us of a certain age, that's how we actually learned about a lot of the bands and the music that really started to resonate with us. I'm a huge fan of the Doors, and I'm a huge fan of the Doors because my uncle, who was massively into a whole bunch of things, gave me a CD once and said, you should listen to that. And I did, and they were awesome. Curation as an activity is a way for us to express to people, this is where we perceive value to be. Nowadays, curation is something that's almost always handled by algorithms. And what algorithms are intended to give you is roughly the same thing that you already know you like, but in a slightly different form. Because of this regional aspect, though, because curation was something that happened in subcultures, what we also get there is a degree of friction between different cultures. Small groups of people who are in contest with other groups of people as to what's the actual media that we should be interested in. So we have in the picture there some punks from the 80s. Punk will come up again because it's quite important as a topic later on. But this was a particular subculture that came with a whole range of subcultures. So if you were, for example, in Brixton, the punk scene was different from the scene in London. And it was very, very different from the scene in Glasgow. These different cultures would have enough common ground that they could meaningfully talk to each other, but not so much common ground that they agreed on everything. So what you got from that was a degree of friction. That friction would lead to cross-fertilization of ideas. you'd find that there's like one group is suggesting an album that you're thinking, well, it's not quite what I like, but I do like this part of it. Maybe I'll look up where that person was involved in other things. And you get this sort of communication of tastes that lead to new and interesting tastes emerging. So the idea of clashes between cultures, disagreements between cultures, all of that is a way to explore a solution space, a way for people to understand what the parameters of cultural taste should be. What we have here are teddy boys, or greasers as they're sometimes called, from the 50s. And this particular group of people were often at war with a whole bunch of other kinds of subcultures. But what we actually see here, anybody seen Grease? You all seen Grease? Yeah. Grease is basically a kind of fictionalization of this kind of culture. But one of the things that's interesting about Greece is it's kind of how we understand these cultures now. To begin with, they weren't quite, again, as homogenized as medias and movies and such would suggest to us. These things were vibrant movements, full of people with very strong views who were attempting to explore new territory and also try to convince other people that this territory was worth exploring. But over time, these cultures, they go away. Teddy boy culture, no longer really a thing. Punk, no longer really a thing in the form it originally was. The mods, not really a thing in the way it was. Disco, yeah, roller skating, not so much. All these things gradually disappear. And over time, that's part of what generates interesting things in society, because cultures split apart, or they come together again, or they go for a certain amount of time experimenting, and then they go through a return to their roots phase. So any one subculture can actually result in being 5, 6, 10, 500 different subcultures. And the more these things fragment and come together, the more vibrant these communities become. All of this is to say that friction between different kinds of groups is good, because friction creates disagreement, and disagreement is what results in people saying, I want to do things in a different way. Back in the early 50s, traditional jazz, as we call it now, was largely about sort of big band swing sounds. It was all about the structure of music. It was about how good you were at playing particular things. It was about being a virtuoso with an instrument, working together with a whole bunch of other people who were virtuosos. However, there was a bunch of people who didn't really like that all that much. They felt it was too constricting. They felt it killed away improvisation and creativity. So they started off with a whole new jazz movement, bebop as it was called. And this had a completely different kind of structure. It would introduce a starting theme, what was called the head. And then from that point on, people would improvise on that. So everybody has a starting point, but you then spend your time noodling around the music to end up with something that was completely fresh every time you played it. But it's only because the friction between the original jazz subculture and the modern traditional jazz versus modern jazz that we get all of the jazz artists that sort of are now widely considered to be the pioneers of this theme. Your Duke Ellingtons and your Lester Youngs and such. It's only because of a disagreement with a culture with which they were regularly in contact that people decided now's time to actually experiment and see what we can do. Another good example of how friction creates creativity. 1960s, and the Beach Boys are a band that you maybe have already heard of. Surfing USA, everybody goes, yeah, that one. The Beach Boys were largely considered to be surf rock, which is to say kind of mindless, catchy tunes that you wouldn't really spend a lot of time thinking about. But then, in 1966, they released an album called Pet Sounds. And Pet Sounds is an extraordinary album. It contains a whole bunch of songs in it that if somebody said to you, that's the Beach Boys, without absent any other information, you would say, that's not the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys can't play like that. It contains songs like God Only Knows and, Wouldn't It Be Nice and all these kind of things. And it was such an incredibly good album that the Beatles listened to this and they said, what we have to do? We have to make a better album than Pet Sounds. Bear in mind the Beatles at the time, absolutely top as far as anybody would talk about in terms of commercial success and even critical success. It's actually relatively rare that you find a band that is both so critically accepted and commercially accepted. But they listened to this and they thought, this album is so good that we need to make sure that what we do is better than that. And then they created Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that music, that album there is widely credited as being one of the first significant entries into the psychedelic movement. They basically created a whole new kind of music from this. And that's not something that was unusual for the Beatles, because the Beatles did this quite a lot. They experimented a lot, and they were often in conversation with not their competitors, but other musicians in the similar kind of area and similar levels of success. But psychedelia wasn't just something that influenced music. Society as a whole was shifted by this. So this relatively, pleasant surfer band then became the reason why psychedelia came about. All because, again, of this friction. This isn't people coming together to form new movements. This is people spawning out of movements on the basis of being dissatisfied with either what they're doing or what people around them are doing. Now, again, as I said, there will be a while before this connects to the theme of interaction medium. But we will get to it. The story of innovation, largely, is that new things replace old things, but not completely. There are always vestigial traces of things. How many of you remember when sea shanties were big during COVID? No? No? Yeah, okay, at least one person convincing me I didn't hallucinate that. You don't remember that when everybody was doing all the sea shanties on Zoom? Wellerman and all these? Oh my God, okay. Actually, we will return to this. The amnesia of culture is going to be a theme as we go on. But I honestly, not a word of a lie, sea shanties were big for a while. There was actually a Scottish postman by the name of Nathan, I forget what his surname was, but on the back of a tremendously successful Zoom performance of a sea shanty, he quit his job to devote it entirely to commercial sea shanties. I have not heard of him since. I suspect it didn't go hugely well. So when culture changes, it's only sometimes that it's sort of like incremental. Often culture changes in big seismic ways at particular times. And that's when enough influences come together in a particular combination to create these moments of genuine change. There was a time when, if you were sufficiently immersed in a decade of music, you could quite easily identify music based on its time frame. Now, I've rephrased the way I talk about this because I've had conversations with people who maybe don't remember the 80s, and sort of identifying songs from the 80s not that easy. But if you listen to, let's say, every top 10 song from the 80s, every top 10 song from the 70s, from the 60s, from the 50s, all the way down to the point where we start recording music, what you find is that almost every decade has a very, very distinctive sonic signature, so that you can relatively easily place, within a couple of years, where a particular song exists in the musical evolution. There is a point in 1979 when Gary Newman comes around and he releases a song called Cars. And what he basically does there is invent the sound that everybody has in their head when they think about the 80s. Instantly synth pop and all these sort of like regular recurring beats and abstract imagery in the songs and such. That became really a signifier of what the 80s would be. And I swear it's like somebody flicks a switch. So, okay, what decade are we in? 70s. Now we're in the 80s. And everything changes from that point. If you think about what songs from the 40s were, Vera Lynn, Somewhere Over There, Be Blue Skies Over the White Cliffs of Dover, those kind of things. There is a particular kind of signature that goes with them. And each decade has this. There is a point in almost every decade where you can do a thought experiment, which is, if I take this song from this decade, send it down a phone line 30 years to the past, hey Marvin, here's that brave new sound you were looking for kind of thing, you would find that the recipient of that would basically react with horror to what would be considered music. So here's a couple of quick, easy examples. So this is Maybe by the Ink Spots. Let's stop that before the lawyers come in. So nice, calming, sort of the sound of the 50s. Now imagine you then decided to play this song down the phone to somebody who's in the 50s. Yeah, they'd be shocked, wouldn't they? Yeah. Come on, come on. Now, there is a cliche when people talk about this, which is you play the modern songs to an older audience, and what they say is, oh, I prefer songs like when I was young, songs you could whistle to, those kind of things. But there is a point whereby music in a particular era sounds alien to people from earlier eras. And that point is roughly, in terms of what history sort of shows us in terms of cycles, roughly 30 or so years. So if, for example, you took disco with its relatively, for the, in comparison to what came before, relatively explicit themes in a lot of songs, a focus on sort of repeating riffs rather than sort of lyrical progression and storytelling, and you played that to somebody who grew up with Glenn Miller, they're going to react quite negatively. They're going to say, that's not music. That's not music in the way I think of music. Elvis was scandalous at the time when he came along. And he was scandalous for a number of reasons. One was the music was different, but also there was a sexuality to Elvis that was missing from almost every artist previous. He got on stage and he started wiggling his hips, and that was enough for people to have moral panics. That was genuinely controversial, that this merging of music and performance was something alien to a generation who might have thought Minnie the Moocher was scandalous. Minnie the Moocher, a song by Cab Calloway, is about as tame a song as you could possibly imagine. So when you take something, like Elvis or his scowling at the camera and these kind of things, and put that in context to Minnie the Moocher, which was, a song where somebody basically does dancing alongside it. That's what the performance aspect was. That would be off-putting to a lot of people. There is this sonic signature that is alien over a particular period of time. And that's important. And it's important because what it shows is that things change over time, and they change in important kinds of ways. Disco baffled a whole bunch of people. Rock music came along and scandalized people. Punk came along and nobody knew how to deal with it. Even at the time, punk was considered something weird and alien and massively transgressive. Oh, stop. But in order for that to happen, the past needs to make way for the present. There needs to be room for new ideas, to be given room to grow. And the more that we have these permanent digital representations of culture, the less room that they make for other things. The big problem is that the past has more good stuff in it than the present does. There's almost never a reason to look around you for great things when you could just look behind you. There's more great literature in the past than was released this year, even though apparently Sally Rooney's released a new book. I don't know if that makes a difference to the arithmetic of it. There's more great music in the past 50 decades than the past 5 decades than there's been released in the past decade. There's always going to be more the further back you look. So if your interest is a good experience, if your interest is having a good time, it's always more profitable to look to the past than it is around you. That's one of the fundamental limitations that culture places upon us now, which is that it's incredibly difficult nowadays to curate a present experience. As decades became increasingly digital, as they became increasingly interested in preserving the great cultural moments, it became harder and harder to actually identify what those great cultural moments are. The Beatles stepping off the plane at Shea Stadium, that's something that you will see repeated again and again and again of newsreel film at the time. Is that really one of the most significant things that happened in the mid-60s? Probably not. But because we've recorded it, that's the thing that we tend to focus on. Gradually, over time, the past has stopped making way for the present. It stopped getting out of the way. It started to hang around more. And in hanging around more, it's reduced the oxygen for everything else that comes along. We start to see nowadays less in the way of local interest, less in the way of sort of regional distinction, and more a kind of globalization of culture. You know, you're not just a fan of the local TV show that they show on your TV channel. You're a fan of Stranger Things. And fans of Stranger Things are all over the world. And technology has sort of shrunk the world to the point that it doesn't even matter how far away people are. Just a few more things to say, and then I promise people can go have a break. Because, yeah, you've probably heard enough from me for at least the first hour. Back in, actually, it's up here. Back in 1993, Jacques Derrida, who was a French social realist philosopher, coined a term called hauntology. So it's taken us, what, 45 minutes to get to the first point on the introduction slide. Introduced this idea of hauntology, and he described that as the tendency of big ideas to hang around long after they've ceased to be genuinely relevant. Now, he coined this term in relation to a number of things, but the biggest thing he coined in relation to is the idea of Marxism. Marxism as a political ideology is dead. It doesn't have any real ability to do anything in the real world. But we are still constantly, regularly confronted with the idea of Marxism, with socialism, with communism. Here's the bad news for Mafalda. The bad news is capitalism won. And it didn't just win, it won an unanswerable victory, to the point that it's almost impossible to imagine a future that does not contain capital as its main driving function. I'm sorry, but that's just how it goes. So these ideas like Marxism and communism, they still hang around. There's still things that you see referenced in constant conversation. America is still overwhelmingly paranoid about the idea of communism and the emergence of communism. It's a thing that people use that, for example, when socialized medicine comes up, oh, no, that's just socialism, that's Marxism. Rather than sort of engage with the idea of, wouldn't it be nice if we could get ill and not end up bankrupt? If people were able to get out of this idea of talking about this in Marxist or socialist frames, there could be a meaningful conversation that happens. But Jacques Derrida talked about this idea of hauntology, that these are ghosts that continue to haunt the debates that we have. Now, I should probably say this. Hauntology, it's a very funny joke because it's like ontology, but in French you pronounce it ontology. It's hilarious. I say that because every time Jacques Derrida wrote about it, he mentioned that this was a joke. This idea of hauntology is incredibly important because what it's basically saying is we often find ourselves orbiting a cultural gravity of things that are no longer genuinely relevant to what we do. And if we permit ourselves to engage with these ghosts, we will be drawn in to that gravity well. Right, okay, so one more slide, then you can have a break. This idea of hauntology is something that's been co-opted by a huge number of fields over the years. And one of the places where we find it most evidently expressed is in culture. So all the stuff I've been talking about in terms of how we stop letting the past go, how the past is now the thing that's not making way for the present and these kind of things. These are hauntological ideas. The idea that culture, as we experience it, has a cultural gravity that isn't actually in the present, but is in the past. This is the thing that I'm saying when I'm saying this becomes a problem. We have so many ghosts of the past that infect our present that it has become fundamentally impossible for most of us to imagine a future that isn't cast in the terms of the past. And if you are interested in genuine creativity, That's a problem. Because these things don't come in with all their vibrancy. They don't come in with all the energy they originally had. They come in as shadows of themselves. They come as photocopies of photocopies of photocopies. Or they come in like a cassette tape that's been listened to too many times. They lose their fidelity. They lose their precision. They lose their nuance. And as a result, what we end up having at the core of culture are counterfeit ideas from a different century. And after the break, we're going to talk about what that actually means for the here and now. Okay? So let's take a 10-minute break. Let's meet back here at 1:15, and then we will continue on with why you should be depressed about the present as opposed to just depressed about the past. Right, let's get back to this then. So, if that's the problem with the past, what does that mean in terms of the present? So, if we could say, here are all the things that happened, oh no, what a problem. Why is it actually something that we need to be concerned about here and now? Jacques Derrida didn't just come up with this idea of hauntology. He's also spoken about a range of things. He's a massively fun guy, so he talks about a whole bunch of things that are equally fun. Archive fever is one of his ideas. And what he basically talks about is that we have become so addicted to the idea of archiving experience that we've kind of lost the ability to enjoy experience by itself. He refers to this in relation to a Freudian idea called the death drive, which again, as I say, Derrida, massively fun guy. But one of the things that he spoke about was, rather Freud spoke about, was this idea that we all know we're going to die. I don't know if that's shocking to any of you. Sorry to say, I'm not, because I'm the protagonist, but the rest of you, unfortunately, I'm afraid, it's curtains eventually. But part of that is this innate desire to archive, to capture experience, to make sure that there is a sign that we were still here when we all go away. And this idea of archive fever was this focus on an archive to make sure that we have this evidence. Now, when we had mostly physical media, not really that big a deal. You know, if you had grandparents who kept journals, for example, that's not something that's likely to overwhelm you when you go through the legacy that they've left behind. How many of you have heard of the idea of Swedish death cleaning? So here's the basic idea. You probably have relatives who are closer to the grave than you are. They probably have properties. Those properties are probably full of other properties. And you don't want to deal with that when they die. It's hard enough when people die without also inheriting a house full of shite. So, Swedish death cleaning is the idea that you should deal with this before you die. You should make sure that you leave your possessions in a good state. So what people are getting are actually a curated archive of your life, rather than just all the things, you know, the broken phone that you said to yourself, well, maybe I'll find a use for this. This iPhone 6, surely that's still got value in this day and age, and you throw it into a drawer. You know, I'm no better than anybody as far as that goes. Freud also identified this idea of the need of archives as part of his discussion of this, that there is this fundamental human drive to do this, that if we can record things, we will tend to record things. And a question here, I'm sure all of us have this experience. How many of you have gone to a concert or something and spent your time like this with your phone, as opposed to spending your time watching what's happening on stage? Go on, be honest. Be honest. Yeah. Let's say a meaningful proportion. Yeah. We do this because we capture these kind of archives and we think to ourselves, well, we'll go back and enjoy those archives. But largely we never do. Back to the thing we spoke about in terms of Facebook, how the memories come up and you think, I have no idea who these people are in this photo. We don't really go on to reconsider these things or recontextualize these things. We basically just offload them onto a system and then forget about them. There's an Argentine author called, here's why this was a risk, because I've actually forgotten his name, George Borges, who wrote a book called The Library of Babel. And The Library of Babel is an incredibly prescient book because he wrote this in 1941. Here was the idea behind the book. It's kind of a short novella rather than an actual full novel. Imagine somewhere there's a library. No, actually, there's more to it than that. Imagine somewhere there's a library, and that library contains every possible book that could ever exist. It has a certain number of pages for every book, a certain range of characters for every book, but every book that could possibly exist is in there. That means inside this library, there is a biography of your life that tells you how you're going to die. There is a recipe book in there for a kind of soup that will give you immortality. Everything you could possibly ever want is in this library, but so is every other book. And that's where the problem comes from. Because these books, if it can contain every book, that's what it contains. And most of those books will be gibberish. Most of those books will be, infinite monkeys on infinite typewriters kind of thing. It will just be random collections of things. But somewhere in this library, by definition, there has to be a book that tells you where to find all of the good books in there. And the book, The Library of Babel as a novel, is kind of about that. The idea that somewhere in this vast sea of gibberish, there is enough meaning that we could potentially find all meaning. And that's a core of what we kind of hope from archives. We hold archives because we think this is valuable. This is something that I will want to refer to later. But we don't have the index. We don't have the thing that tells us what's worth paying attention to. I have hundreds of gigabytes of photos, and I don't think I've ever looked at any of them. Why is that? Because I don't know which ones are in there. I mean, there's some that are pictures of, maybe cooking at night. It's quite nice. But there's also photos I took of my foot while I was walking somewhere. There are good photos in there, there are bad photos, and I have no idea how to find one over the other. What we're dealing with now, as part of modern culture, is basically a Library of Babel situation. It is no longer possible for anybody to keep up with any meaningful subfraction of any subculture. Here's some relatively straightforward statistics that just show how difficult it is. There are 4 million new books every year. 4 million new books. If you tried, I don't think you could read half of that. We have 500 hours of new YouTube videos every minute. Over 5,000 new board games published every year. Around 4 million terabytes of data created every day. Now, most of that data is metadata, like data about data, but nonetheless, that is a vast, vast amount of information that's being created on a second-by-second basis. By the time I finish this sentence, there'll already be more books released than you have time to read in this year. So who gets to keep on top of this? Who is actually able to take modern culture and condense it down into what's worth caring about in modern culture? And the answer is none of us. None of us can do this. There is no way on earth anybody can meaningfully keep on top of any of this. For a number of years, I did a blog reviewing board games, and it was impossible for me to even keep up with the top 5% of games released in a year. So when I would say things like, oh, this is the best game I played this year, people rightfully, they didn't say this, but they should rightfully say, who cares? That's a tiny fragment that you're exploring. Why does your opinion mean anything? And the answer is, it doesn't. It's not actually informed by enough for this to be a meaningful guide to you. On the left here, we have an extract from Pitchfork releasing albums for one day. And this is just the albums significant enough for Pitchfork to recognize they're even out there. It doesn't include, your brother's band release that they put up on Bandcamp. Is that still a thing? It doesn't include like limited edition releases by obscure Japanese artists you've never heard of. It's just the things that are actually considered culturally significant enough to merit inclusion on this particular webpage. But that's a lot of albums. If you wanted to listen to all of these albums enough to get a meaningful impression of them, you can't just listen to an album once and understand an album. You need to listen to an album again and again in different moods, in different contexts. So by the time you've finished with October 11th, it's already October 20, and now you're 9 days behind where you need to be. So that's kind of the experience of trying to keep up with modern culture. Every single day, you're multiple days behind where you need to be. Or in some cases, every single day, you're multiple years behind where you need to be. Sorry? Yes, no, well, sure. Unfortunately, one of the things I'm not going to talk about here is the divorce that this has created from time, because we didn't have enough time for it. But yeah, I'm basically unmoored in time all the time. So with all that in mind, with the fact that we now have so much content, so much in this archive, so much great stuff behind us, and who knows what stuff we have in the present, what's the problem this actually creates? There's a cultural commentator called Mark Fisher, and he has written, or he had written extensively about this idea that he referred to as the slow cancellation of the future. And that's basically what we're facing now. This inability to perceive what we actually can curate from the moment, this focus on what's previously been curated in the past, and that greater cultural gravity of the past changing how we interpret the future. Now, I know that sounds complicated, but we'll play about with this idea a fair bit. So as I say, if your goal is to play good games, listen to good music, watch good movies, you're always going to have more success looking backwards. If you want to get a sense of what the meaningfully great movies of the 40s were, it's not that difficult. A, there weren't that many of them released. And because there weren't that many of them released, they've been relatively well curated. Same for the 50s, less so for the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. As time goes by, we get less and less of the breadth of culture and more of a kind of slice of it. Not even necessarily a deep slice, just a slice of culture. Because for a long, long time, curation as a role was about identifying what's worth paying attention to in the present. When the role of that changed, so did the way in which we appreciate culture. Curation nowadays is usually more about finding the weird nuggets from the past. And this manifests in a number of different ways. So originally, radio DJs, what they were looking to do was sort of make taste, show you the best albums, play them on the radio, get you interested in them. But now, mostly when we talk about DJs, we're not talking about people who are curators for radio. We're talking about people who are curators of samples more than anything else. You know, people who are looking for these interesting licks and riffs from the past and how they can recontextualize them in the future. That has fundamentally changed the role of curation, as in it is no longer a case of looking around us, because everything around us is kind of the same stuff as we've already seen. We'll come back to this in a bit. Because there is so much culture, curation has become impossible. And so what tends to happen is we rely on more and more regular, comforting tropes that we're already familiar with. There's a guy called Grafton Tanner, and he wrote a book called The Hours Have Lost Their Clock. And what he talks about is what is essentially this persistent nostalgia industry and why nostalgia is so successful. One of the things that he talks about is that back in the 50s, cultural crossover was a lot easier than it is now. Let's say you wanted to draw a picture of Mickey Mouse wrestling with Goofy, and you wanted to make that available to people. Now, there's no internet, so basically it was just available in your local context. But people would see it and they go, oh, yeah, I see those characters, that's nice. A couple of years ago, Disney found out, no, was it Disney or was it McDonald's? I think it was McDonald's, actually. They found out that the therapy, like the waiting room of a child's therapy office had been painted to look like Ronald McDonald. Now, I don't know why that's calming for children, because Ronald McDonald is terrifying. But they've basically done this sort of unauthorized version, and the lawyers descended on them because they didn't have the rights to the Ronald McDonald character. We used to be, as a culture, a lot more loosey-goosey about copyright. The very first video games, for example, were based on Star Trek, and they were based on Dungeons and Dragons. They didn't have licenses for them, but nobody really cared enough because they never received that kind of cultural penetration that everybody knew about them. But as time's gone by, copyright has become increasingly limiting. These terms of copyright have become increasingly onerous. And what that means is that our ability to interpret and remix cultural products has become less and less and less. So if you do nowadays want to make a picture of Goofy wrestling with Mickey and stick it up on Instagram, the chances are Disney's lawyers are going to be after you before too much time telling you to take that down. So it's not just that we've lost this ability to imagine a future, it's that it used to be easier in the past. And if it's easier in the past, why not look to the past for these kind of things? It has basically become increasingly difficult to unpick the inspiration from things from the actual value of things, to the point that often what we tend to see these days is that everything is built on everything else. So I already talked about the example of You Can't Hear This and the Beatles, but here's just an example of what I mean. If you are a studio artist nowadays recording an album, you might hire a drummer to do the drum tracks. And then when you get into the studio, there's a relatively good chance that you will take that live, messy, imprecise performance and replace it with sampled drum beats, because people prefer the crisp, clean, precise effect of a digital artifact over the messy recording of a person. Now, if that happens once, maybe that's creative in and of itself. But if it happens in every album you're dealing with, then everything starts to feel and hear the same. Auto-tune is another particularly good example of this, because most modern musicians who are sort of big performers, well, maybe most is a strong word, but a lot of them can't actually sing. What they do is they have auto-tuning in the background that is tuning the performance so that it sort of lifts them to the right note or drops them to the right note based on what's nearest. And what that means is a lot of live performances these days all kind of sound the same. When it comes to what algorithms are pushing to us from Spotify, from YouTube, from all these different kinds of things, they're pushing us stuff that sounds kind of the same because they know we like that. Generally speaking, the more that we rely on algorithms for curation, the less likely we are to encounter anything that surprises us, that shocks us, that goes against our preconceived notions. And that's a massive shame, because all of the great things that have been introduced into my life have been because they are different from other things. So this is Mark Fisher. He has been tremendously impactful on my thinking on this, because this is basically his idea, this idea of the slow cancellation of the future, that we have lost the ability to imagine the future because we're spending so much time obsessing about the past, and the past is a remix. We spend so much time obsessing about the present, and the present is a remix of what comes from the past. And he poses like a number of thought experiments. I'm just going to leave one with you. I'm not going to talk about it again, but just here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine a future 50 years from now. Humanity has left Earth and has moved into a life among the stars. What does that future look like in your head? Now, I will say, to preempt this, my bet is it looks like, dirty and grim, like an alien movie, all neon and bright, like the cyberpunk aesthetic, all clean white lines, like the Star Destroyer from Star Wars. It's unlikely it's going to be radically different from something that's already experienced in modern science fiction culture, because that's our vocabulary nowadays. Once upon a time, we did invent future things. Nowadays, we just sort of reinterpret the past. So this is what he basically talks about, is this idea of modern culture has become a photocopy of itself, endlessly photocopied. Because every time we make a homage to the past, we are basically taking a limited version of that thing and reproducing it. Greece, coming back to this example, is not an accurate reflection of 50s teddy boy culture. It's really not. And that's not just because people didn't go around singing the way they did like that. The actual aesthetics of that are performative. But if you ask somebody, what did it mean to be like a greaser in the 50s? Greece is the cultural touchstone. So it's not actually the original culture that people think of, it's the cinematic representations of that culture. And given how most of us, including myself, are divorced from the original culture here, all we really have for authenticity are the original sort of earlier movies. And then the movies that are made from those movies, further subdivided from it, movies made from those movies, things become mushy. They lose fidelity. And in the process, we lose a lot of nuance. When Sgt. Pepper's was remastered, which it was a few years ago, one of the things that they did was they tidied up a lot of those messy human moments that we can't hear, you can't unhear this, the YouTube channel digs into. So it would lose, for example, the sound of Ringo on a track shouting something at John Lennon. It loses that kind of stuff. And what you end up with is a higher fidelity, more accurate, more precise song. But what you lose is the nuance, the detail, the heart that goes along with it. Mark Fisher refers to this idea that we are losing the ability to meaningfully invent a new future as 20th century culture, but on 21st century screens. And I think if we are meaningfully critical of modern culture, you'll see there's a lot of truth in that. Top image there, that is kids playing Dungeons and Dragons in E.T., which is a movie that was released in 1982. And underneath that, we have kids playing Dungeons and Dragons in Stranger Things in 2016. Stranger Things is what I often refer to as an almost perfect example of a hauntological TV show. It is so mired in references to the 80s that you could have made this TV show in the 80s. Maybe not technologically as sophisticated, but you could make this shot for shot. Maybe, again, with some rubber masks and things rather than the computer graphics. But the heart of Stranger Things could have been something that came from the 80s. You could put that back in time to the 80s and nobody would blink an eye. What people would say is, oh, I didn't realize Steven Spielberg was working on this. Because it is almost entirely a Steven Spielberg property. It is so immersed in the homages to the 80s that it's almost not its own thing. The biggest distinction that we tend to see in these kind of things is technological rather than creativity-wise. As in, you can't make Stranger Things using 1980s technology. The technology behind it is too sophisticated. The images are too sophisticated. The computer generation graphics too sophisticated. But if you can look past that, there's nothing really there beyond what you would expect to see in the 80s. How many of you have watched the Fallout TV show? Okay, a few of you. Fallout, which is where the song, the Ink Spots Maybe song, maybe most of you have heard of it from there. But Fallout is an example of a hauntological franchise in several levels, because Fallout is based on what's called a retro-futuristic aesthetic, which is how people in the 50s thought the future would look. And what they thought it would look like would be roughly like the 50s, except, you know, bigger, better, faster. You know, atomic power was becoming quite popular at the time, so people assumed cars would be atomic powered and those kind of things. But also, what Fallout is based on is a modern conception of how retrofuturism was understood in the 80s. So again, we've lost a lot of the cultural commentary that retrofuturism brought about. And in doing this, what we tend to do is we tend to lose the awkward edges of things. Retrofuturism, which talks about, you know, the 50s as an idealized starting point for technology, what it forgets is the 50s weren't idealized for everybody. You know, if you were a white straight guy in America, 50s, I'm sure they were awesome. Anybody else, bit trickier. So when we actually see these aesthetics sort of drawn past their original context and then into modern times and then reinterpreted in further times, what we lose is the complexity that goes along with it. You might find in Fallout, if you look into it, that there is something of a satire in there about consumerism, about the Cold War, about a number of things. But it's strikingly, it has very little to say on a whole bunch of important social issues at the time. So this is this photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. When people were watching Grease for the first time, or when people watched American Graffiti, which is a film that was about set in 1962, but with a weirdly 50s vibe to it, you couldn't watch that without thinking, what happens the following year? Because that's a seismic change. It was released close enough to the time that you could understand the context of the timing of the year. But it's difficult to do the further back you go. The harder it is to, the further you have to go, the more divorced you are from these kind of contexts. So that's part of this issue here, this photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. What we now have is kind of an alarming situation, which is this might be the first point in culture where the biggest difference in culture is not to do with the culture itself, but to do with the technology with which we experience culture. So I mentioned this idea of physical media becoming digital media, becoming something that we no longer had to worry about spatial requirements for. When we moved from CDs, actually, let's go a little bit further back. When I was, I don't know, 10 years or so, what I got for Christmas one year was a Sony Walkman. And let me tell you, a Sony Walkman was a thing to have. It was the thing to have. Now, for those of you who are thinking, what's a Sony? What's a Walkman? It was basically a hand-sized cassette player that you would plug some headphones into, and you could listen to music wherever you wanted to go, provided you had the tapes with you. So what you tended to do was you tended to make your own mixed tapes of favorite songs. Quality of those would degrade over time. You would listen to them again and again and again. But the fact was you had music available with you wherever you wanted to go. And that was seismically influential in how a lot of people experience music. But the fact was you had to decide at the start of the day what music was going to come with you, which tapes you were going to pack into your school bag kind of thing. Old family road trips used to be a similar kind of thing. You had to pack a number of CDs along with you, and that was what you were going to have for the full road trip. And again, as I say, radio was an option. Yeah. Then you have to listen to what other people want to listen to. And not anybody in the car, just people in general. Being able to carry music with you was genuinely something worth money at the time. But we didn't lose anything from doing that because we still had to make these conscious choices. Was I going to be bringing the Beatles with me, or was I going to be bringing the Doors with me? I couldn't bring all of them, so I had to bring a subset of them. But then we moved to, how many of you remember Napster? Yeah, the old people down here remember Napster. So Napster, for those who are too young to remember it, was essentially, well, let's not be around the bush. It was a way to pirate as much music as you could possibly want. You would type in the name of songs, you would download them from somebody's computer, and what you would tend to find is you were downloading, like somebody had just said, we're going to pay you for every megabyte you download. You would have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of songs. Ace of Base, absolutely, I'll have Ace of Base. Who are Ace of Base? Doesn't matter, I'll have them. You would grab these songs just wildly off people's computers, and then you'd never listen to them because you had your favorites. You had the ones that you actually wanted to listen to. But then the iPod came along. And then what happened was, instead of you having to curate which music you wanted, you put it all on there. And that's when we sort of lost this touch of the physical consequences of what we do. Because how many of you actually have a music collection? How many of you just have a Spotify account? Yeah. Spotify has done something to music. And what it's basically done is created a kind of playlistification of music. As in, okay, again, another question. How many of you listen to albums? How many of you don't know what an album is because you're not that old? Actually, most of you put your hands up there, which is very, very encouraging. But nowadays, artists complain about the fact that their music is being listened to out of context and out of order. When CDs came along, one of the things that came along was the ability to shuffle albums for the first time. If you wanted to shuffle a vinyl, that was an ordeal. You had to sort of constantly move things from track to track. You could speed up through it, but you couldn't shuffle things. Cassette tapes go forwards and backwards. You couldn't just stop and start at particular places. But CDs added a shuffle functionality, and that changed the way a lot of people listen to music. They'd put an album in, they'd put it on shuffle, and they would lose the connection between the tracks. And once you've lost the connection between the tracks, once you've lost that stitching, what does it matter if you listen to a song from one album and another song from another album? Spotify is kind of the apotheosis of this, in that it is basically, it's so hostile to the idea that you might want to listen to an album. It tries so hard to stop you. And it tries so hard to stop you just from listening to your playlists. Have you noticed this new feature in Spotify? When you put it on shuffle, the very first thing it'll do is smart shuffle, which is it will insert random stuff into your playlist. And you're playing it and you're thinking, I don't remember why I liked this one. And the reason is you didn't. But the algorithm is constantly trying to get you to engage with this new music because that's how Spotify keeps your interest. That's what I mean in terms of the big distinction is now the technology rather than the culture. I mentioned Taylor Swift earlier. Taylor Swift as an artist would not sound remotely out of place in the early 90s. And I know she wouldn't because I was listening to artists like that at the time. She sounds like an updated version of the Dixie Chicks or Alison Krauss or these kind of artists. Obviously, tremendously talented, very good music, but it is still music that is very, very grounded in the music of the past. You probably couldn't make a Taylor Swift album using the technology of the 90s because it's all very tightly synthesized and sampled and all these different kinds of things. But in terms of the heart of it, the thing that's changed is not the culture. The thing that's changed is the technology that gives us access to that culture. And there is no seismic shift remotely equivalent to the introduction of punk for modern society. But there are technological shifts. There are huge technological shifts. I think I already asked how many of you collect vinyl. Can I see your hands up again for that? So, okay, I'm not going to call you hipsters this time, even though I will quietly think it to myself. Okay, not very many of you. But the resurgence of things like physical media, like, for example, this is a bad room to do this with. I was going to point out how many of you were using notepads for taking notes, but I don't think there's actually many of you at all. Paul, yeah, but you're very, very old, so it's not really making my point. Actual pen and paper. Yeah, for those who don't know, pens were things that you'd put them on a paper and they'd come up with some ink, and paper was basically yeah. That's good enough for me. So what we see with a lot of physical goods these days is what I think is basically a rejection of this lack of physicality. Board games, for those who don't know, are undergoing a massive resurgence. And part of that is because of this rejection of the idea of a lack of physicality. We feel unmoored from things in a lot of cases. So when we see people collecting vinyl or collecting CDs, or even nowadays collecting cassette tapes, when we see people buying boxed retro video games, or when we see people buying Moleskine notepads, what we're basically seeing there is kind of an attempt to regain the frustration of physicality, because that frustration is important. Like the process of getting up to put on an album, to swap between tracks to tracks, that forces a mindfulness that isn't there otherwise. If you can just sit there and let music drift over you, that's what you'll do. An ex-student of mine, the one, incidentally, I do like people other than Taylor Swift, but she's going to come up again a number of times here. One of my ex-students introduced me to Taylor Swift as an artist, and she gave me essentially access to her Taylor Swift playlist, which is like her ranked list of these songs. And I've listened to that playlist quite a lot. I could not necessarily tell you the name of any of those songs on that playlist, because that's not the experience I have with this. I didn't buy, let's say, Tortured Poet Society and then sort of read the backliner and say, oh, so these are the songs that come in order. And yet, if I put on L.A. Woman by the Doors, not only do I know the names of the songs, I know the order in which those songs are going to come in, because I've listened to that album so many times. This technological aspect is where most of the evolution in culture has come from in these years here. Now, remember that thing I said about how different decades have a different sonic signature, and you could tell the 80s from the 70s and so on. What is the sonic signature of the 2010s? If I played a song from you from the 2010s, would you be able to identify it as being from the 2010s? Well, let me tell you. I found an artist a while ago. Spotify suggested it, ironically. And I listened to it and I thought, oh, wow, this is great. This is a great new band. I'm going to be the cool hip person and introduce people to this new band. The band was called the Veronicas. The Veronicas were around in 2001, and I was convinced that they were banned from 2022. That's how difficult it has become to identify sort of the provenance, the musical provenance of all these different kinds of artists. Because we keep reinventing these things. We keep taking these lessons from the past and building the future upon them. Now, part of this is also because of the way in which we talk about culture. So what I have here, don't worry about reading them because there is quite a lot. I have two music reviews here. One, which is about Sgt. Pepper's, the other one about Tortured Poets Department. It's not actually anything that's said here that's particularly relevant, but rather the way in which we actually talk about these things. In here, talking about Sgt. Pepper's, there is very little reference to what's come before. There's a mention to vaudeville, but that's sort of like so broad a reference that it's almost not a reference at all. It talks about the songs, it talks about the structures of the songs, how the songs relate to each other, the history of the artist, and how the artist came about with. Then we have this review here. And what we can see is a review that is basically structured like an academic paper, and that everything is citation to other things. So, you know, beyond a virtually undetectable Post Malone appearance, best friend, rival, Lana Del Rey, alternates between co-writes within blah, 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 blends all the previous approaches, rap-like conversational version. So what it's basically doing is showing the credibility of the writer through citation by pointing out all the influences that the writer's been able to pick up on. But that's kind of a sad, tired way of writing a review, because it's exactly what makes academic writing so impossible to read. Academic writing, dry, desiccated, so interested in referencing the lessons of the past. As a result, there's nothing there realistically about this album at all. Antonov's songs come closest to our post-1989 chart toppers. Destiner's fulfill her plans to remain an album artist. What does that even mean? It's just in relation to songs and albums that have come before. It's not actually saying anything. Is this album worth listening to? Who the hell knows from this stuff here? You read the Sgt. Pepper's one, and you will understand whether you should listen to Sgt. Pepper's. Here, you get a good impression that the artist knows Taylor Swift quite well. So this sort of deference from the past is something that you now see again and again and again in modern culture. And not only do you see it in modern culture, you also see it in how tentative modern culture is. As in, previously, artists would have just stolen outright from each other. And I'm not saying this is good, but back in the 50s, for example, if you heard a good rock lick, the chances are you just go, that's a good rock lick, and you'd add it in your song, and nobody would say anything. Often those particular good licks were coming from, for example, disadvantaged Black artists who couldn't actually afford legal protection, but nonetheless, it was easier to remix culture sort of on a vertical basis. But now, if you include something that just kind of sounds like something else in another album, the chances are you have a costly legal battle ahead of you. If you use a phrase, now again, I do like people other than Taylor Swift, but the song, Shake It Off, where she says, haters gonna hate. Apparently, that is so close to another artist where the artist says, the haters will hate, that is actually the basis of a legal complaint. So when you have to be so careful about these kind of things, the citation, it sort of creates this weird incentive for you to not be that creative by making sure that you recognize and acknowledge all the things that things have come from. But that's not really how culture works. We immerse ourselves in culture. We don't necessarily know where particular influences come from. And as a result, it makes people quite timid. But when we do have these immaculately cited reviews and analyses of modern music, modern TV, modern anything, it is basically just an academic study at that point. And academia is, unfortunately, the place where ideas kind of go to die. This is the point where you write things down so that they're recorded. But most of the vibrant conversation that's happening in most academic disciplines is not happening in academic papers. I work in games. Most of the stuff that's really interesting in games never makes its way to an academic paper. It's happening in EA, it's happening in Ubisoft, it's happening in the indie scene. So this deference to the past is another one of the problems that I think are core to this issue. So here we have a guy called Howard Bloom, who was a very, very influential literary critic. And Howard Bloom wrote, in relation to poetry, a whole bunch of things. But he did identify an incredibly important concept, which is the concept of belatedness. And this is basically a thing that you might actually find yourselves experiencing a lot of the time. And it's this idea that everything worth doing has already been done. And if everything that's already been doing has been done, then what does it actually even mean to be creative? We speak a lot in numbers of courses and in different kinds of meetings and such about how everything is a remix. Everything that we do in society is built on other things. We bring these things together. But this idea of belatedness is the thing that holds people back in a lot of cases. We have here, I assume everybody knows what South Park is, but again, I'm very old. Do you all know what South Park is? Do you all know what The Simpsons is? Okay, good. There is a particularly interesting sketch in an early South Park that talks about this idea of belatedness, not explicitly, but it basically expresses the sort of anxiety that comes along with this. And it's the Simpsons Did It sketch. I'm not going to play it because we don't really have time. But this is the character here, Butters, has come up with a whole bunch of ideas for what he could do in essentially an episode of South Park. And there's another character that keeps saying, no, the Simpsons did that, the Simpsons did that, the Simpsons did that. This is basically the belatedness of animation. It's almost impossible to do something in animation that The Simpsons didn't do because The Simpsons has been running for 500 seasons by now. And in those 500 seasons, it's had 20 episodes. And each one of those 20 episodes has like 2 or 3 themes in it. There's almost no chance that you can come up with something in animation that The Simpsons hasn't come up with. But nonetheless, we still have to kind of do something. Howard Bloom also introduced this idea of the anxiety of influence. And that is the process of this belatedness and also the acknowledgement that because there's so much that's come before, we can't break out of those patterns. That there is very little in the way of genuinely meaningful original creativity that we can do. And he identifies basically the solution as this: find a way to acknowledge influences or overcome them. Thanks, Howard. That's very helpful. How do you overcome this? He never really gets quite into the answer for that. But this is basically what we mean by this idea of citation, that we are so worried about this belatedness, so worried about this anxiety of influence, that we feel this overwhelming urge to make sure that we are referencing and citing things. We do not help as a university system when it comes to that, because this is what we insist on. We insist on this kind of citation because otherwise plagiarism or some variation of it. But what we are basically doing here is we are reinforcing this anxiety of influence, this belatedness, and we're not doing you any favors through doing that. Let me just check and see how many we've got to go. We're fine. We're absolutely fine. So one other cultural commentator that's spoken about this quite a lot is a guy called Simon Reynolds. And he wrote this really interesting book called Retromania, which is pop culture's addiction to its own past. What he's basically spoken about here is that when we talk about the cultural experiences that we have, even when we're talking about new artists, new movies, and so on, what we're basically doing is reshuffling stuff that's come from the past. And that's the technology that lets us do that. We shuffle these playlists. We shuffle YouTube playlists. We shuffle all this kind of stuff. And we remove these things from their context, and those contexts are important. This is not, right, I should probably say here, this is not something that is universal. I'm not saying there is no creativity out there. There are lots of things that are creative out there. The problem is that when we talk about creativity and culture and pop culture, what we're basically talking about is a kind of selection bias, or rather we're talking about a kind of survival bias. When we think about, what are the prominent television shows from the 80s and the 90s, Frasier, Friends, those kind of things. What we're not thinking about, generally speaking, are the things that didn't survive to come to our attention. We're not thinking about the shows that lasted 6 episodes and then got cancelled, the Netflix gambit, basically. We're talking about things that actually survive into public consciousness, which means that there are a huge number of interesting subgenres and interestingly creative niches of things, but they don't really become hauntological. They become constrained and restricted within a particular context. When we talk about this idea of pop culture's addiction to its past, we mean successful pop culture in relation to other kinds of successful pop culture. And this is one of the reasons why this is a thing you should be frightened about, because this is what generative AI is. Generative AI is a fundamentally hauntological technology. And that what it does is it mines all of human creativity, all of human endeavor, breaks it up into little parcelable chunks, remixes those chunks together, and presents it back to you as a kind of counterfeit creativity. If that's what you are doing as individuals, well, bad news for you moving into the real world. Generative AI is going to absolutely crush you, because that is what it is good at. It's better than you are at it. It's quicker than you are at it. And I swear to God, it's cheaper than you are. The thing that people talk about when it comes to generative AI, they often say, it's fine, it'll never do things as well as a human can do. And that might even be true in a lot of cases. But the bad news is that couldn't matter less, because it just has to do it cheaply, it has to do it quickly, and it has to do it without attaching one of your salaries to it. So this fundamentally hauntological technology is, I suspect, going to be the defining technology you have to compete against in the future. And if it comes to that, well, how are you going to compete? And the answer is, you're not. You're not going to compete. You may as well give up now. Accept. So this is the world in which all of you are going to be emerging as professionals. And part of the problem is solved by knowing the problem exists. The problem that we have here, this hauntology aspect, is that we are haunted by essentially the creative decisions of past decades. Recognizing that, that's part of us way to the solution. The key thing that we need to do now, though, is talk about how do you actually break out of this? How do you actually produce creative results that are better than an algorithm could produce? You don't have to be the smartest person in the world. You don't have to be the most creative person in the world. What you have to do is acknowledge and identify the problems and the sort of structural inefficiencies in creativity that we within the university system kind of teach you to do. And the good news is, maybe, that's going to be part 3 of this lecture. So let's again take another, let's give them a 15-minute break. Let's go nuts. Let's have a 15-minute break. We'll meet back here at 1:15, and then we will talk about the solutions. Right, so let's finish off here with what is hopefully something a bit more optimistic. Although I should probably first explain what's just happened here. Mafalda not particularly keen on the idea that capitalism won and continues to win and will win every single time. We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, so did the divine right of kings. Which is nice, but I'm from the UK and we still have the divine right of kings, so not hugely convincing, unfortunately. So, having presumably thoroughly depressed everybody about A, your career paths, B, the state of society, and did I start with a 1 or did I start with an A? 3, essentially just the entirety of the way in which creativity actually works. Let's talk about some possible ways to break out of this kind of pattern. Now, the unfortunate thing is I have a much stronger view on the problems than I do on the solutions, but let's talk about some of the ways in which potentially you might be able to be more creative than generative AI, because that's what you need to aim for. So at the time of writing, there are 33 Marvel movies. I think I wrote this a few weeks ago. It might be 40 by now. If you add in all the extended cinematic universes and things, I don't know, possibly thousands. One of the things that distinguishes society at the moment, and this is a thing that's particularly important when we talk about generative AI, is that society as in general has lost the ability to start and finish things. We've lost the ability to just say goodbye to things. When we look at interesting, innovative, valuable franchises, what we tend to see is well-written stories that were designed to be a place to begin and a place to end. But once capitalism, there you go, Mafalda, once capitalism gets hold of these things, they don't become stories. They don't become universes. They become franchises. And that's where we see a lot of the risk and things when it comes to generative AI. Imagine you could take a piece of technology, feed it with your favorite story, and then say, and then what happens? Or, and what happened before that? That is basically the future that generative AI is promising. That we are going to be able to say, well, what happened to this character at the end of this? And it will generate a whole story. Story will be rubbish, but it will generate a whole story for you. Part of the ability to be creative, part of the ability to avoid this trap of hauntology is to say enough is enough. To say this is the point at which this thing has ended. And once this thing has ended, I'm not going to give in to the traps of nostalgia. I'm not going to give in to the traps of fear of missing out. I'm going to say from this point on, this was finished. Because this is basically the malady at the heart of modern creativity, the inability for any successful popular culture to be finished. I don't know how many Star Wars TV shows there are at the moment. I would say too many. And I would say most of them didn't really need to be told. Stefan tells me Andor is very good. Maybe get round to that. The Mandalorian was pretty good. The rest of them, I don't think we needed a book of Boba Fett. I don't think we needed an Acolyte. I don't think we needed any of these kind of things. I think it's enough for us to say, guess what? This story is now done. So here's the thing that you need to ask yourself. Where do things begin? Where do things end? And where are you happy saying that these things are actually finished? Because if the hauntological is about the fact that we can't let go of the past, that's kind of on us. As in Derrida and Mark Fisher and all these people have identified a malady at the heart of creativity. But the cause of it, they haven't really spoken about. The cause of it is us. The cause of it is the fact that these things are comforting. These things are nostalgic. You know, I cannot watch a Star Wars movie where the scroll comes up and it does that big opening chord. Oh, it does things. It does things to me because it just reminds me of a happier, simpler time where there was only one Star Wars. Not multiple Star Wars. There was just the one of them. And once you lived through that Star Wars, you were fine. But it does that to me. It gives me that sort of thrill of recognition. There are certain albums I own that when I listen to those albums, they take me right back to where I was as a child. And this is sort of something of a digression, but it's not really the same when you listen to them on Spotify because they sound clean. They sound full quality. But the music I was listening to was muffled and distorted because I listened to these things on cassette tapes because that's how old I was. But they still bring me back to a particular time and a particular place. They're so tightly encoded in my mind. The world these days is pretty grim. I think that's fair to say. And a lot of people find the retreat from that grimness in nostalgia, in a sense of, this is a time when I actually was happier, a simpler time. Yeah. About memory, it doesn't have to do with that. Yes, we have these sort of encoded versions of memory that are often missing the uglier parts of things. Like, for example, you might remember the comfort from watching a particular TV show. What you probably don't remember is, for example, your parents arguing in the back, unless that is the thing that you focus on. in which case that's probably not a memory you want to return to. But these kind of memories that are sort of positive associations, they are a comfort in uncomfortable times. And that's what we're currently living in. So step one, don't give yourself the easy surrender to nostalgia as often as perhaps you might want to. I'm not saying nostalgia is bad, but what I'm saying is nostalgia is a tool. And as a tool, you have to know when to use it and when not to use it. And part of that is knowing when things start, when things end. We also live in a society, capitalist society, where basically we're constantly balancing two competing trends. And this is actually a powerful diagnostic tool for seeing where particular things, particular industries and such see themselves. Do they see themselves at the start or do they see themselves at the end? And it's the balance between exploitation and exploration. This is the thing that we all do all the time. Like, let's say you arrive in Gothenburg for the first time. You're coming to a university. And as part of arriving in the city, there's a relatively good chance that you're going to spend a lot of that time exploring that city. You're going to find out where the good restaurants are. You're going to find out where the good, I don't know, what do you kids do these days? Bookshops? Where the good bookshops are. You'll find out where sci-fi book handling was, and then you'll never look for another thing from that point onwards, which is how I did it. But when you first arrive in these kind of areas, you spend a lot of time finding your options. So you know, oh, that thing's over there and that thing's over there. Oh, that serves this and that serves that. And you'll do that to begin with, because that's what you do when something is new and it's unexplored and there's a lot of potential in it. There is a certain point, though, where you flip over to exploitation, which is you've found all the things that you want, and now it's just a case of getting the maximum value out of these things. So you found 20 different restaurants, but you found the one restaurant that you actually like. You found the one takeaway place you actually like, and you will continually use that one, and only occasionally exploring other options. And then at a certain point, it tips over entirely into exploitation. And that's kind of what we are now with a lot of pop culture. Why are so many remakes and reboots and remasters of popular old properties being carried out these days? And it's because we've moved out of this exploration phase and we're now in this exploitation phase. Why are there so many Marvel movies? Because they make money and it's not going to make any more money to invent new intellectual property. This is an exploitation phase that we're in. So identifying which of these two phases are we in is a good sign as to what the rest of culture thinks about the potential of a particular area. So if we're just constantly making the same kind of TV shows and the same kind of properties again and again and again, we're in an exploitation phase. That suggests, though, is that there's exploration that's not happening. And when there's exploration that's not happening, that's a place for you to consider, well, what can you contribute to this? We've already said that. No, we haven't. One thing here about this. How do you actually do this, though? How do you actually focus on not exploiting when other people are exploring and not exploring when other people are exploiting? And some of it is just down to change the way in which you think about these things. I know that's easy to say, but there is sort of like a little trick for it. How do you stop yourself from engaging in the comfort of returning to a familiar Star Wars, a familiar Star Trek? How do you stop yourself doing that? When you look at the vast range of the different kinds of exploitations of these properties that come along, the question to ask yourself is, what am I going to regret if I don't engage with this? Not what do I think I will get out of it, but what do I regret by not engaging? A lot of this kind of stuff is built on what's called FOMO, which is fear of missing out. And you don't want to be the person missing out on cultural conversations or possibly a really nice lightsaber battle or whatever it is you're actually getting out of these things. But if you ask yourself the question, what am I losing if I don't engage with this? What you will often find is the answer is nothing, really. How many of you are so completely comfortable with the history of this world that you couldn't learn something about another country? Well, let's see if we can get a leading answer. Okay. How many of you are, on the other hand, massively familiar with the lore of Middle-earth? That's not going to give you anything valuable in real life. There is a certain point, Mafalda, where you will learn that capitalism won. So if you sort of immerse yourself in Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power and all these different kinds of things, you will learn an awful lot about the minutiae of a thing that realistically doesn't matter that much. You could, for example, be spending that time learning about the history of Tibet or actual genuine mythology. You know, these things are as rich and as interesting as other things, but they actually connect more and they give you sort of room to work with. You can't write realistically your own stories set in the Star Wars universe. You can write your own stories set in Twilight, provided they're pornography, and then you rebrand them. You can do that. But if you want to write a story that is a Star Wars story, there's nothing really you can do with it. Guess what you can do with mythological characters? You can write whatever you like about them. So you can actually draw these things in as inspirations and use them in a way that popular culture won't let you do. Popular culture is a creativity trap. It does not permit you to reinterpret or remix these kind of things. Disney, as a company, kind of ironically, is one of the reasons why copyright is so long and so aggressive, because Mickey Mouse was about to drop out of copyright, and they thought, oh, hang on, this is a problem for us. So they petitioned again and again and again to increase the length of copyright terms because they wanted control over Mickey Mouse. Disney, I will remind you, some of the properties that they've made money from: The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, others. They have made billions reinterpreting public domain stories and then making it so that you can't reinterpret their versions of this. Pop culture, as far as this kind of thing goes, is a trap. It will pull you into its gravity well and not actually let you escape. I'm not saying don't enjoy popular culture. What I'm saying is that once you get to the point where realistically you're not getting anything out of it, don't worry about it too much. So earlier I brought up this idea of the anxiety of influence, and this is another thing that I want to talk about at least a little bit briefly, because this is a thing that, based on conversations I've had with students over the years, is a massive problem. And it's a massive problem that I don't think we speak about enough. And the problem is imposter syndrome. Okay? So I have given a number of talks over the years in which I've basically said, I am a massive fraud. There is no reason why any of you should listen to me. This isn't a bit. This is actually true. None of you should be listening to me. I am an idiot. I'm an idiot who just so happens to have control of this PowerPoint. Oh, thank you. Not 100% sure how I feel about that, but thank you. Yeah, I'm an idiot. I don't know anything about this. I've read a few books about it, but I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I have some opinions and thoughts on it. But if you ask me, are you an expert in any of the stuff you've spoken about? The answer is no. If you ask me that about any of the things I talk about, the answer is no. I constantly feel like a fraud whenever I'm talking to people. And that's basically what imposter syndrome is. The last university I worked at was, I don't know, let's say the university before that was literally the bottom of the league tables. That is the level, the quality of the university that I'm used to working in. I moved up to a slightly better one after that, and then I moved here to what's actually a really, really good university. As a result, I don't really feel like I belong here because I don't. I haven't had the same trajectory. I'm describe myself as a working class academic. And in a lot of places, that's a contradiction. You know, most academics don't, like, I'm the first from my immediate family to go to university. And then I never left, basically. But I'm the first in my family who went to university. So the idea that I would then sort of progress to the point where I'm teaching these kind of courses and things, that's nonsense to me. That doesn't seem like it's a thing that should happen. If that resonates with you, then imposter syndrome is a thing that you might want to look into. Imposter syndrome is the idea that everybody else is here by their own personal qualities. They're here because they're smart and successful and they earned their place here. But you're here because of luck. You're here because things went right for you. You don't deserve to be here, but you're here regardless. Imposter syndrome is destructive because in 99% of cases, 95% of cases, it's not true. The vast majority of people suffer from imposter syndrome, but they don't deserve to suffer from imposter syndrome. So if you are thinking to yourself, I'm not creative, I'm not smart, how can I possibly break out of these kind of patterns? It's imposter syndrome that's talking to you here. And I think this is one of the big barriers to when it comes to, believe it or not, the theme of this lecture, which is the big failures. I know this is the first time I mentioned it, but it was in the slide, so it was in the title slide. One of the things that the civil service in the UK say is, take the troublesome thing and put it into the title because it does less damage there than in the text. So yeah, if you spend all your time thinking about this, the key thing to know is that the chances are a lot of you are feeling, I won't ask for a show of hands, but there are going to be a lot of you who are sitting here thinking, oh, is this actually a thing that other people feel? Years ago, I had a student come to me just when he was about to graduate. And he said, can we have a meeting? I said, sure, about what? He said, I just want to talk about something. Said, okay. So we arranged this meeting. And he said, I'm about to graduate. And I don't think I know anything that I'm supposed to know. And everybody else seems to know what's going on. Is that a bad sign? And I said, no. Like, there's 90% of your classmates who are feeling a similar kind of thing. Imposter syndrome turns up in a lot of cases in a lot of people, and it is the thing that will stop you believing that you can actually be genuinely creative. Do not let imposter syndrome convince you of this. Your minds are not on your side. Your minds occasionally will do you a favor so often, but most of the time, what your minds are doing is undermining you. Okay? So, we talked about this idea that all this kind of stuff in culture is basically a remix. And that's true, but it's always been a remix. This idea of belatedness is also kind of a false idea because, yes, everything that was supposed to be written about has been written about. That's not actually a problem. Ironically, Howard Bloom, who's the guy who sort of talked about this idea of belatedness, talked about why it's not a problem. And he talked about it in terms of his principles of interpretation. And one of these principles of interpretation was, everything has an aboutness. Everything is about something, even if it's not actually explicitly supposed to be. That aboutness demands interpretation. And it is possible for multiple interpretations to exist at the same time, all of them being true and none of them agreeing with each other. By which what I'm saying is, sure, somebody has already done the thing that you want to do, but you haven't done the thing. And the thing that you want to do is going to be different because you're the one doing it. Again, imposter syndrome will be the thing that says to you, don't do this, but don't listen to imposter syndrome. Part as well of overcoming this gravity of the past is acknowledging what you're actually influenced by. Meme culture, in particular, is a massively hauntological aspect of modern internet culture because it's the same ideas rehashed again and again and again, sometimes slightly interpreted, but basically sort of continually finding old hauntological references and bringing them into a modern context, which is the kind of thing that we're talking about here. One of the easiest ways to write something that feels dated is to include modern references in it. Basically, you have to avoid the obvious sort of instant connection with your audience that is also one that's very, very tightly tied to a context. You have to be very demure, very mindful. If you have these kind of influences that come to mind, as soon as you put them into something, it's already out of date. The fact that I said that there, like, we know that is no longer a timely reference. We knew it wasn't a timely reference when Joe Biden used it. We knew it was no longer fashionable when NASA used it in one of their Twitter feeds. If it is something that is genuinely timely, if it's genuinely something that is of lasting cultural significance, then that's absolutely fine. I think you should all constantly reference Skibbity Toilet, for example, because let me tell you something, that's going somewhere. But these kind of, like, if you look at something like Ready Player One or that kind of thing, what that is basically a hauntological book that's built on in-jokes. Those in-jokes are sort of reliable because of how far the provenance of them. They're from the 80s and the 90s and such. But we are currently living in a time where we don't know what timely references are. And I mentioned I was going to talk about this, which is the incredibly short amnesia cycle when it comes to modern society. It is possible for something to become viral on Monday and out of date on the Friday. That is just a feature of the internet now, because these references get brought out, they get used, they get reused, they get rinsed to death. Then a late night talk show host references them, and that's them done. And then we move on to the next thing. Every year on the internet feels like you're living through 10 years because there are so many sort of controversies and upsets and all these different kinds of things. How many of you remember Baked Bean Dad? How many of you remember the woman that put the cat in the bin? How many of you remember sea shanties? These are all actual genuine sort of viral trends from just a couple of years ago. We don't remember them because we never committed them to memory. They're not something that's actually important. So if you're sort of orbiting this meme gravity well, try and break out of that as well. It's not that memes are bad, it's just, you know, they're not exactly examples of creativity, even if they do make us laugh. What we teach you to do in universities, and I've said this a few times already, we basically treat you to be referential. In fact, sometimes we teach you to be reverential of things that you shouldn't be reverential of. We teach you particular kinds of design methods. We teach you particular kinds of academic concepts. We teach you it's important to reference your inspirations. And all of that is true in an academic context. But it's a pretty poor way to genuinely sort of reach for creativity. Because what you're basically saying is, this thing I'm doing now is a thing that other people have done before. And that's, again, not really what we're hoping to accomplish when we want to sort of step out and do better than generative AI does. Part of what imposter syndrome will also tell you is that failure is to be avoided. Now, in fact, not even just imposter syndrome, most of us have been told this at some point in the past, that success is more important than failure. I don't necessarily think that's true. And in fact, I don't think that's true at all. I think if we look at life in terms of how we are all contributing to a common cultural core, the failures are usually far more interesting than the successes. When it comes to exploring the range of possible solutions to something, it is almost always the weird edge cases that explore more of the environment. If you know that there is a particularly successful strategy, fine, go use it. I'm not excited about it. I doubt you will be either. But if you take a weird concept and you tie it to another weird concept, what you're basically then doing is breaking out of this pattern of going for the things that you reference, going for the things that you reverentially include because we've told you to include them. The problem with citation as an idea is you are referencing explored territory. And that explored territory, again, is comforting. It's also kind of nostalgic to return to techniques you've used again and again and again. But if you do want to improve as professionals, if you do want to make sure that what you do is creative and innovative and novel, you have to break out of this as a pattern again. Imposter syndrome will say, you're going to fail if you try and do this. Your response should be, good, fine, bring it on. Because failure, as I say, is good. Failure is how we learn how to do things better. Sometimes staff and I are sort of involved at different kinds of levels when it comes to master's thesis. But we have, I think, a shared philosophy on how we advise people to approach master's thesis, which is, yes, you can say, oh, I'm going to make a database and connect it up to a web page, and it's going to have like a login page. And yeah, okay, fine. You know, do these things here, and that's probably going to get you a master's pass. But I don't care about it. You're not going to care about it by the end of this. Nobody you tell about this is going to care about it. What we like is heroic failure. well, we prefer heroic success, but heroic failure is a decent second, by which aim for something big, aim for something that you don't necessarily think you can accomplish, because that's how you break yourself out of your patterns of familiarity. There's a concept in pedagogical research that's called the zone of proximal development, which is as long as things aren't too hard, and as long as they're not too easy, as long as they're just a little bit outside your grasp, you will improve by trying to do these things. So if I sit down and play chess with Garry Kasparov, I'm probably not going to learn that much from the experience, because, I mean, it's been a while since I checked the rankings, but I'm fairly sure he's higher ranked than I am. If I play chess with basically a random person off the street, I'm going to learn more playing chess with that person than I am with Garry Kasparov, because Garry Kasparov is just going to destroy me in a few moves. But you know, somebody else, somebody who doesn't have that level of experience, might be enough of a challenge that I learn a bit from it, and then enough of that, and enough of that, and enough of that, then I can beat Garry Kasparov. I don't know enough people. That's why I'm saying I can't beat Garry Kasparov at chess. Somehow that's even worse. So yeah, the idea that a heroic failure is better than a boring success, that's something that I think is worth holding to you, because what that does is encourage you to break out of these comfort zones. And those comfort zones are imprisoning you. Comfort is a prison as far as this goes. And also never forget, weird is good. In almost all of the CVs that I've looked at when I've been recruiting for things, I tend to see that they all, like people generally, well, men generally will apply for a job regardless of whether or not they're qualified. But mostly you can assume for people who make it through like the initial filters that everybody you're looking at is qualified for the job to a greater level extent. So actual competence in a job is less interesting to me than somebody who has something that stands out in their CV. I once gave somebody an interview because they had like a year of existentialist philosophy in the middle of their technical degree. And I thought, oh, let's put that one on the maybe pile just to see what happens. Weird is good because weird stands out. And we're in a world where standing out is incredibly important. So, oh God, are we going to manage this? We'll try. So here's an example relating to your assignment of a weird topic that I think would be an interesting thing to consider. Now, it's coming in kind of late in your course for you to do anything with, but here's a concept that is, I think, fascinating. Whether or not it's useful, that's a different thing, but I think it's fascinating. And the concept is called psychogeography. So psychogeography is, here's how it's described by one of the more prominent psychogeographers. Psychogeography is the fact that you have an opinion about a place the minute you step into a place. The minute you come into this room, you have an opinion that comes from this room. The minute you step into, Nordstrand, you have an opinion about Nordstrand. The opinion being way too loud, way too busy. Yeah. What we're looking at within this discipline is the intersection of psychology and geography. And what that basically means is, how do we feel about places? And how do we actually get to the heart of what we feel about places? There's a guy called Guy Debord, and he was the leader, I guess, of the Situationist International Movement. And the Situation International movements were part of a tradition of philosophy that said that what we're basically trying to do to change society is to force people to acknowledge the situations within which they are and how to engineer situations to particular kinds of goal. He posed this as a kind of scientific approach to getting a feel about a particular area. Now, the problem with it is nonsense, absolute nonsense as an idea. This is not a scientific idea. Charitably, you might refer to it as pseudoscience, but that doesn't mean it's not worth considering. He was actually building on the work of a whole range of literary psychogeographers who wrote intensively about not just what it was like to be somewhere, but how it felt to be somewhere. Certain authors, Daniel Defoe, for example, Edgar Allan Poe, another example, Dickens also. These were authors who wrote about places as if those places were characters. And in doing so, what they did was uncover something of the nature of a place. A lot of poets also did this. William Blake did this a lot. Wordsworth did it a fair amount when he talked about, the difference between I wandered lonely as a cloud and sort of the darkness of industrialized Britain. In the comparison between these two different ways of talking about things, there is something to be understood about the nature, the psychological nature of these areas. Now, ideally, what he was trying to do, and I say this was a pseudoscientific approach, but this is how he described it: the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. Sounds good, sounds convincing, sounds sciencey. The problem is, Debord and his various devotees were massively naive in terms of how they actually understood these techniques to work. The primary tool that they used was called the derive, which is basically an unstructured, unplanned walk through a particular place. I forget his exact, not just forget his exact name, I forget his name entirely. There is a psychogeographer that says, okay, here's how you do psychogeography in its easiest form. Sorry. You have an area. Grab a map of Gothenburg, put a cup down on it, draw a circle around that cup, now walk that route. That's an example of one of the sort of active psychogeographical techniques that people sometimes use. Because if you start any place in Gothenburg and walk with an intention, what you'll end up with is being drawn down familiar pathways. You'll end up going down familiar routes. Even if you're not consciously thinking it, at the back of your head, you'll be saying, well, if I go down there, there's no buses. But if I go this way, I can get the bus home. Just at the back of your head. So having this sort of idea of you're going to walk this route regardless gives you a chance to explore a city in a way that might not otherwise be instantly accessible to you. But ideally, this idea of the derive is that you just start someplace, you amble in a direction, and you just see what you find. One of the more prominent psychogeographers is a guy called Ian Sinclair. And one of his projects as part of the psychogeography was to walk the M25, which is the orbital road that goes around London. And in that, what he basically spoke about was how the texture of particular places changes based on, for example, the foliage around it, the material used to make the roads, what kind of traffic at particular kinds of day, what it's like to try and walk across one of these roads, because he would try and walk across the M25 and all these different kinds of things. He wrote a book called London Orbital about this. It's 700 pages of what it feels like to walk the M25. It's not a book I necessarily recommend, but it is a fascinating first few pages. But yeah, this idea of sort of like getting hold of the soul of an area by just inhabiting the area is what's at the heart of this kind of idea. The problem with the way Debord and such used it is they would basically go into a place and then assume their impressions were scientific observations, which is not what they were. So they'd go into a street and they say, oh, everybody's very sad here. There's something wrong with the geography. And realistically, what happened was there'd been a death on the street and everybody'd just been at a funeral, that kind of thing. You can't really sample these kind of things with individual explorations. But that's not to say that this as a tool, weird as it is not something that gives you genuine insight. There is something of the personal experience that you can get from psychogeography that you can't get with almost any other kind of technique. You can go into a place, sit there and make scientific observations, but you'll never really get to the psychology of what's going on. Scientific observations do not have the personal touch to go with them. Scientific observations have to be extracted from context. They have to be generalizable. They have to be quantifiable. But if you want to get to the heart of what it's like to be in a place at a particular time, you just have to let yourself immerse it. Immerse it, immerse yourself in it. As a result, what this means is that there are a whole bunch of techniques associated with psychogeography that you're probably not going to see mentioned in any of your other methodologies. Guy Debord, as I say, one of the people who was particularly responsible for this, described this as charmingly vague, which is generally speaking not something you find ascribed to scientific theories. Darwin did not present the theory of evolution by saying, this is charmingly vague. But at the heart of this idea is this charming vagueness, because what is an impression? What does it mean for you to have a feeling about a particular place? How do you communicate how you feel about a particular place? So here's some of the examples that come from psychogeography. Poems. How many of you are considering writing a poem as part of your assignment? Sketches, ethnographic notes, word clouds, heat maps, novels, documentary footage. Pretty much anything that is the right form for expressing the thing that you want to express about a place is potentially a psychogeographical methodological tool. What if you want to put tracing paper over a thing and sort of get an impression of something? Also a perfectly valid psychogeographical tool, because your personal input into this is what's important. There is no right way to conduct one of these things here. There are only information-rich ways and less information-rich ways of doing things. Is that something that if I had talked to you in week 1, is this something I would have recommended as a technique? Probably, but then it doesn't matter if I pass or fail. I think I probably would have suggested it to be a thing that you think about. But the question, is this going to provide actionable results for your assignment? I don't know the answer. What I do think, though, is that engaging with tools like this, techniques like this, that are a little bit off the beaten path, is how you expand your sort of circle of knowledge around these kind of things. It's less about the results and more about the fact of engaging with weirdness. Psychogeography is a weird technique. It's practiced by some of the weirdest people you will find online. If you do a search for psychogeography on YouTube, these are some interesting characters that you will encounter with interesting opinions about a whole bunch of things. None of them I would necessarily describe as exemplary. None of them I would describe as role models. But nonetheless, a weird, obscure technique that has applicability in a particular area that might yield you something of interest, something that you wouldn't get through any other tool. What I'm basically saying here is that, yes, this is probably going to fail if you rely on it purely for your assignment. But in the failure, you will learn something. And as part of that learning, you will carry on into other things. And maybe in future, you're doing psychogeography in super weird environments. The psychogeography of a cathedral. Now, there's something that sounds like it's fun. Sounds like something that would be useful. Psychogeography of social Gothenburg? Maybe, but the only way you'd find out is by trying. We have spoken, I promise we are coming to the end of this. Actually, let's see, are we coming to the end of this? We're sort of coming to the end of it. Yeah, any questions? Yeah, so. This is the subliminal version for those who missed bits of it. Right, I will speed past a chunk of this because, yeah. Let's go for the final couple of slides because we are running very short on time. All of this, coming back to what is the theme of this lecture, the answer is still, I don't know. Part of it is about this idea of exercising this hauntological part of your practice, because hauntology is not a bad thing, but it is a problem when technology is going to do hauntology better than you will. You know, if you want to find out what happens at the end of when Frodo goes to the Undying Lands in Lord of the Rings, ask ChatGPT what happens to Frodo once he goes to the Undying Lands. It will make up a whole story for you. That's not where you want your creativity to lie. What you want here is to generate stuff that ChatGPT couldn't generate. So while psychogeography is a technique that I recommend, there's a couple of concepts I also want to introduce here. One is the idea of a semantic orbit. So in our heads, we have a whole bunch of neurons. Those neurons will fire in relation to things that are said. So one of the reasons why memes are so, comforting is because we've seen them again and again and again, and our brains know how to interpret them. Our brains understand the pattern of them. Whenever a concept is mentioned for the first time, the neurons around that concept, the things that are storing this idea, will warm up, ready for the things around it. If I say the word dog to you, then cats, which I have canonically described as the little own brand version of a dog, because, dog's better than cats. Show of hands. Yeah. That is not a message that resonates with people. So when you say cat, when you say dog, The bits of your brain that are related to cats warm up because your brain says, hey, a dog's been mentioned, therefore we might need to talk about cats soon. The closer ideas are to each other, the more linked they are in this idea of a semantic orbit. This is not a tool that you actually have available to actually like evaluate what's happening inside your head. Everybody encodes this information differently. But the thing to think about is how closely semantically aligned are two things. Because the further they are apart, the more likely bringing them together is going to give you something new and interesting. You know, bring cats and dogs together and then you have Tom and Jerry. You know, it's a well-established formula. Bring cats and wolves together, a little bit further, funnier. Bring cats and monkeys together. That's a TV show I'm going to watch. So with this idea of semantic orbits, you are stuck with the things that you are familiar with. So what is the solution to actually introducing weird and unusual techniques? And the answer is the thing that we constantly recommend to you almost everywhere throughout the program. And that answer is collaboration. While the people who are in this room probably have a similar kind of way of thinking about things by virtue of the fact you're all sitting in this room, I'm willing to bet you have some super weird friends. Those super weird friends probably have super weird ways of thinking about the world. And those super weird ways of thinking about the world, that's where you find meaningful, what's called juxtaposition. You take something else, and even if they don't seem to fit together, bang them together and they actually might. None of you can be expected to know everything. None of you could be expected to know everything in terms of techniques and what you have available. The answer to that is to talk to people you wouldn't otherwise talk to. Make sure that you collaborate with people who are part of different disciplines. And I don't just mean interaction design and games. And I don't mean games and software engineering. I mean interaction design and anthropology. I mean interaction design and quantum mechanics. I mean game design and shipbuilding, that kind of thing. The farther apart these things are, the more likely you are to find unusual opportunities. Game design and dentistry. If you want to make a horror game, that's a combination that I would be exploring. Collaboration, these kind of things, is the key. It's hugely important. But there are also a few other things that are important. One thing, and I don't think we do this well in universities, is give you time to breathe. You can't innovate reliably to a deadline. You can't necessarily innovate reliably to a particular time frame. We don't give you a lot of time to just let a concept sit with you. And that's kind of what this lecture is sort of, I've decided that's what the theme of this lecture is. That's one of the things that you can do by introducing yourself to weird techniques and things. Just let them sit with you for a while and see what presents itself. I also massively recommend here the idea of what's sometimes referred to as the slow academic. Now, not necessarily that you all count as academics here, but let's say the slow professional. This idea that doing fewer things better and slower is better than doing lots and lots of things quickly, because you cannot reliably, again, innovate when you're under a time pressure and when you're under a productivity pressure. Give yourselves a little bit of time just to allow ideas to sink in. Don't instantly worry about if they're immediately applicable. This lecture is useless to you, but it might not be useless to you in the future once you've had time to think about it. It might be something that over time begins to sort of invade your thinking. I have had, I've given lectures like years and years ago, and I'd have people in the first year saying, I said, no, you've had this as well, haven't you? Yeah. You occasionally get this message saying, I didn't see the value of this at the time, but my God, I see the value of it now. You know, sometimes these kind of ideas do take a long time to sink in. So also give yourself time after one of these lectures to think, okay, that one's going to have to sync with me. You don't instantly have to integrate it into your professional practice, but it's worth sort of giving yourself time to really explore how these things connect. So just a little bit after time, which I'm kind of proud of because I honestly thought we would be here till 7. Here's the conclusion. Number 1, I don't know. Number 2, go be weird, go be creative. Weird is important. Weird is valuable. Weird helps you stand out. It's not something that we generally encourage a lot of, but The weirder you are in the way you use things, the more likely people are to remember what you're using. I have had master's students recently who, if they asked me anything about their master's project, I would say, was I your supervisor? I've had those kind of experiences. And yet I have other students who, the minute they tell me what they did, I say, I remember absolutely everything about this project because that was super weird. So this is a way to, make sure that you catch into people's minds. Failure is where innovation is. So do not worry about failing things. Do not let imposter syndrome tell you that just because you're going to fail, that's not worth doing. Sometimes that's the only thing that's worth doing. If we know that successes are inevitable, what's the point in sort of confirming that with yet another success? Yes, you can connect a database up to a website, well done, but we've learned nothing from that happening. And chances are you've learned nothing from doing it either. Take things slow, give yourself some room to breathe. I know that's hard when you have deadlines and things looming. I know it's easy for me to say this because I don't have the deadlines, but give yourself as much time as you can to just let things relax. Don't at the end of this, I didn't think this was likely anyway, but don't at the end of this lecture think, well, now I need to put this into practice, because I don't know how you put any of this into practice. But don't just think instantly this now has to be applicable. Give yourself the time just to let it simmer, see how it connects to things. Not everything matters right away. There are too many Marvel movies, and I'm still very happy I live in a world where I can listen to Taylor Swift live. Thank you very much, everybody. Does anybody have any questions on that 3-hour epic? Yes, what can I do for you?